I agree. It's going to have to be a working document, working living document, but with flexibility. Thank you very much, panel. I really do appreciate you being here. So we're going to call the next panel up. Pardon me?
Just we're short on time. So,
Pardon me?
just that we're short on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is what it is.
Yeah.
So we're going to call up R.J. Cervantes. He's the Director of Legislative Affairs for the California Trucking Association. Mike Jacob, the Vice President and General Counsel of Pacific Marine Shipping Association. Michael Shaw, Vice President of Government Relation, the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. And James Jack, Executive Director of Coalition for Responsible Transportation. Gentlemen, we're running a little bit over, so if you could keep your comments to the point, and if there is any kind of comments that are kind of overlapping, ditto is appropriate. So look forward to your comments. Mike, why don't you go ahead and start off?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. Mike Jake with the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. We represent ocean carriers and terminal operators of California ports. And thank you for inviting us back after the preliminary meeting you had at the end of the summer and session last year. So just as follow-up, not to belabor any of the points from maybe before, I wanted to talk a little bit about where we see this going and what we'd like to see in the plan coming out in the draft, and where we think we can work together with the legislature and with the administration moving forward on making investments. And I think that that's what we want to key on, that the plan needs to be investment focused. We need to be oriented to investments, whether you're talking about the environment or you're talking about infrastructure. The plan is about making investments in new equipment, new technology, new infrastructure, and we need to be practical about how we go about doing that. The action plan itself represents an opportunity for the state to do the long-term planning necessary for us to make strategic decisions about how we both spend public money, but also how we leverage and incentivize additional private financing to go beyond what happens anywhere else in this country with respect to the next generation of infrastructure for trade. So we believe that the goals in the executive order are to be supported. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have, as Hassan said, you can have a growing economy and you can have a cleaner environment at the same time. But it requires you to be strategic about your investments. And if you're not strategic and you're not doing infrastructure affirming work here, it's not going to be successful. And I think working through our efficiency group, I think it's worth pointing out one of the examples that we'd like to see worked out in the short term, addressing bottlenecks. We think that the draft should identify priorities for reducing bottlenecks in the system, whether it's in the highway system or amongst nodes like those we work in. Those bottlenecks create inefficiencies, they create environmental impacts, and they dampen competitiveness. And the plan should go through and identify and prioritize those bottlenecks, relying on RTPs and local priorities like they did in the SCAG RTP appendix. It's very well done. It identifies bottlenecks. You don't need to recreate the wheel, but it needs to identify the prioritization policies for that. You need to address funding questions for it. You need to actually say, how is the best way for me to actually achieve the infrastructure improvement or the operational improvement that's going to achieve the outcome you expect. And then with respect to long-term investments, that's zero emissions equipment. And with respect to marine terminals, we believe that it's possible. And we've done the research ourselves to show that it is possible with engineering firms. We're working with the administration now to set up briefings to talk about that in advance of the plan being released. But again, it needs to be realistic. You can't ask for people to make investments or dictate investments that aren't predicated on a policy that actually requires you to look first at how are you going to finance this? How are we going to fund it? Whether it's public financing, how do you evaluate its effectiveness over the long term? Whether or not everything you're looking at is an appropriate vehicle is a separate question. How are you going to actually get the incentives in, and how can we tap into things like the GHG reduction fund? We supported last year a bill, and Mr. O'Donnell will support his AB 1657 again this year. It's very direct about saying if you have these resources from your GHG reduction fund, you should direct them back into trade infrastructure. You reduce emissions both from GHG but also for particulates and a lot of other criteria pollutants, but it also fosters environmental competitiveness. It's in line with the thinking of the executive order. We think that that's something that you need to look at. And if this plan isn't addressing infrastructure, we're missing an opportunity. We miss an opportunity to inform how we're making decisions, and how we're having our discussions about making decisions about what happens with the GHG reduction fund, what happens with the next TCIF. We've moved past, I think, and I don't want to denigrate what's happened because TCIF is important, but I think it's important to say that you've heard a lot about TCIF today because the Sustainable Freight Plan is not starting from scratch. We're in a context. The context is we've been working on these issues now for at least 10 years in earnest with the state, and we're no longer going to be successful in a regulatory control, command and control environment on one side, and we're not going to be able to geo-bond our way out of this on the other side. It's just not realistic. So understanding that, what does the next generation have to look like? It needs to focus on incentives. It needs to focus on how do we partner together. All of that's predicated on economic growth. So to bring it back, I think, to where we'd like to see a lot of this coming is there needs to be a lot of work going forward, not necessarily in the plan itself solving these problems, but setting up the policies to analyze the way that the state's going to analyze the challenge of economic growth. Setting up the baselines, of course. Analyzing how those happen, yes. We support the Go Biz proposition that you need to actually make sure that you're not harming business when you're making investment decisions in the future about how you're going to regulate equipment purchases and things like that. Absolutely. That should be a no-brainer. That should just be common sense. The state should never want to be in the business of putting people out when they could do it in a better way. So obviously we do support that. But moving forward, hopefully the final draft will say our policies are we want to work on finding ways to grow the economy so we're actually getting the revenue in that supports the new infrastructure we need through alternative methods. And you don't have to have a silver bullet. You don't have to have that answer by July, but you need to have the process in place in the plan to facilitate that. No plan should answer all those questions, but every single plan should foster the questions continuously being asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Michael Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Michael Shaw, California Manufacturers and Technology Association. And without repeating, I think what Mr. Jacobs said and what I expect, some of my colleagues here on the panel will say shortly, I just wanted to note, manufacturing job growth is lagging behind the rest of the nation. And certainly the goods movement system plays a role in the decision-making of where manufacturers locate new facilities, where they grow facilities, so effectively where their investment dollars go. So, in December, for example, we gained 1,600 manufacturing jobs in California, which was a small fraction of what the nation saw, and certainly at a slower rate. We can do better, and this certainly discussion today and going forward can play a role in that. And it's not to say that, again, the sustainable freight or goods movement is in contradiction or in conflict with economic competitiveness. In fact, as the governor notes in the executive order, economic competitiveness needs to be a part of that consideration. And we would just simply state that it's equal footing. It's not a subsidiary goal or secondary or tertiary goal. It needs to be on equal footing, because ultimately California's environmental laws and regulations make really any job that we create in this state cleaner than it would be elsewhere. So to the degree we can grow our economy, we are in fact improving the environment from a global perspective in particular, and that is a beneficial thing. Plus the jobs that come with it, the dollars that come with it, the tax dollars to support our programs. These are all great benefits. So to get back to the point of our discussion this afternoon, competitiveness needs to be a part of that. One of the factors in manufacturing these days is just-in-time manufacturing, or inventories, not stocking a bunch of parts and pieces for things you're going to build some point in the future, but having those pieces arrive just in time that you need them. I'm thinking of one manufacturer who builds large, very large gas turbines. They wait until all of the pieces are in place before they begin construction of the unit itself. In fact, that same company, Solar Turbines, based down in San Diego, has talked to me about a particular transportation issue that they've had to deal with. related not to the inventory or the materials coming in, but to actually moving their goods out. And that is the issue of taking about 2 or 3 days to move a turbine from San Diego area, Kearny Mesa, where their main facility is, to the Port of Los Angeles. So a 120-mile trip that would take, well, give or take a couple of hours, depending on what time of day you make the drive. It takes 2 to 3 days to move a piece of equipment of that size. Now, granted, it is oversized and overweight, so there are special permit issues that go along with that. That perhaps is an issue that could be addressed in this discussion as well that doesn't necessarily involve massive infrastructure investments, though those are needed as well ultimately. But being able to more efficiently move those goods helps a great deal. They are looking at alternatives. One option that they have available to them is the Port of Houston. It takes almost as long to move from San Diego to the Port of Houston as it does from San Diego to the Port of LA. It's slightly greater cost, but they have a little bit more certainty, their delivery times. And if you're looking at going across, the other side, across the Atlantic, potentially, other parts of the world, there's opportunity where they might be able to, it may be beneficial to them to do that. Improving the flows of goods movement is critical to manufacturing being successful and growing here in California. We appreciate the attention that this committee, that the governor, the agencies involved are putting to this. We, as stated earlier, and I think as everyone has probably reiterated today, would encourage you to make economic competitiveness a big part of that discussion, and to ensure that manufacturing has a ability to move parts in and finished goods out. To be competitive here in this state. And again, when we do that, when we create those investments in this state, we have an opportunity to improve our economy, but also to improve the environment, particularly, as we talk about climate change as a global issue. I mean, the governor, I think, today had another release about 127 different subnationals now signing on to the Under 2 MOU. This is an opportunity for California to have a global impact, again, at the same time benefiting our state from an economic perspective. Thank you.
RJ?
Chairman Frazier, members of the committee, RJ Cervantes with the California Trucking Association, thank you for allowing me to make a few remarks today. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your focus on freight, and our members greatly appreciate that, and excited to be here today. But I would echo a lot what Mr. Jacob said in regards to the process of this plan, and his remarks also on the need to focus on investments. But I do want to take just a couple minutes to focus on 2 important factors, one of which we're hoping gets addressed in the plan, and then one we're hoping that the committee and you, Mr. Chairman, can continue to monitor. The first is the issue with stranded assets. Our members have invested and continue to invest billions of dollars in new truck technologies to meet the mandates that were placed on them in years past, and we're continuing to do that, and we expect to do that up until 2023. So you have thousands of trucking companies who are holding on to these trucks with the expectation that they'll have some minimum amount of time to be able to use that technology to recoup their investments. And we need that security. That's what's going to keep us competitive in trucking, is a security blanket that says you are going to be able to keep this asset for a minimum amount of time. And we would urge the legislature to continue to work with us and other regulatory bodies to make sure that we have that security blanket. That's vitally important. I can't stress that enough, and hopefully that gets addressed in this plan. The second element is the concept that was briefly discussed today about facilities emissions cap. Our members are greatly concerned about this regulatory concept, and we continue to monitor it as it moves forward. And Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, as hopefully you've heard a little bit about today, our members are greatly concerned about the the lack of clarity on that and where that is going. And so we urge all of you to keep an eye on that one and make sure that you're working with industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. James Jack on behalf of the Coalition for Responsible Transportation. CRT is a broad cross-section of freight interests, but today I'll primarily be speaking on behalf of our major importers who are the customers of California's ports, companies including Lowe's, the Home Depot, Target, Nike, JCPenney, Best Buy, Hewlett-Packard. First and foremost, CRT and its members are fully supportive of the goals outlined in the executive order: reduced emissions, improved efficiency, and increased competitiveness. And we also want to commend the administration and each of the leaders that were up here on the first panel. This has by far been the most collaborative and stakeholder process that we have experienced, certainly in the decade that I've been working on freight policy on behalf of this group, dating back to the GMAP in 2005. There are probably two critical steps in the process that still need to take place. And being the last speaker on the last panel, I'll summarize them briefly. The first is, and this was touched upon a little bit before, so I won't elaborate, but it's vitally important that at the conclusion of this process, we've established metrics to measure our progress on meeting the three goals of the executive order, not just measuring our progress on air quality and emission reduction, but also on the other two goals of improving efficiency and increasing California's competitiveness. And the second is we really need, the next step in this process is we believe going to be one of the most imperative ones, and that is the cost analysis. Just for context, the cost of one battery electric drayage truck was recently estimated by the Port of LA to be $450,000. One of our member companies just launched the first LNG-powered container ship, which was built in San Diego last year. The cost of that ship, relatively small one, 3,000 TEUs, was $175 million. The cost of the first zero-emission terminal in the country at the Port of Long Beach, which is going live here in the next couple of months, $2 billion. The key question is who is going to pay and how much? And the answer to that question will have a profound impact on whether California remains an attractive destination for cargo. Cargo diversion is a real issue that creates a ripple effect across the economy. Jobs at ports, terminals, rail yards, warehouses, distribution centers, and in the trucking industry all depend on this cargo. So it's extremely important that we undertake an intensive analysis of the draft strategies that are released in April to fully understand the cost of industry and the impact on discretionary cargo before any final recommendations are selected for inclusion into the final plan submitted to the governor. We're very appreciative of the leadership of Director Avdis and Mike Rossi in identifying resources to perform this analysis. Our only remaining concern is the timing, as we expect to see the draft plan come out in April. We know the final plan is due to the governor in July. That leaves us a very compressed period of time to make very important decisions to measure the economic cost and figure out who is going to help pay for the cost of transitioning to zero or near zero emission technology. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Donnell?
Yes, thank you. I just want to point out, Mr. Jacob and Mr. Jack, I think your point is well taken that we need to partner in finding these solutions with industry. And, the cap and trade dollars seem like the perfect place to go for me. And my fear is when those dollars are doled out, potentially, in June or wherever it may be in the next budget cycle, that it's just going to be a feeding frenzy, and they might just go anywhere. And in fact, if you looked at something that came out, I believe, from the LAO last Friday, there were even suggestions out there that you could do that with a 2/3 vote, almost go, I guess, from a fee to a tax, I guess was the implication. And then, hey, you could use them for whatever you want, or you could not. You wouldn't only have to use them for greenhouse gas reductions. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see that even suggested from the LAO. So I think we need to really watch this closely to make sure those dollars go, they're driven, they're driven to where they need to go for their purpose, from which they originated. Not something creative comes up along the line, oh, we can drive the dollars this direction, we can drive them that direction, or I can just build a park in my assembly district with my name on it, and that'll make me happy, and then I won't complain, I'll just vote for it. Again, I really hope the industry watches and weighs in on where those dollars go, because I know I will be. And with regard to Mr. Cervantes, you talked about the predictability of one's asset. As one who represents the port area, the two ports, LA and Long Beach, and then the associated infrastructure, that includes the trucking companies that have all gone to basically LNG or something akin to LNG. And now they're hearing rumblings of, well, now you're going to have to, in so many years down the line, go electric. Well, I've made a significant investment in an asset that I predicted would last this long. Now, all of a sudden, mid-course, I'm going to have to shift and buy a new type of truck, and that leaves me with a truck that I wouldn't be able to use, wouldn't be able to sell, or might have to sell in some other state because they're not following these mandates, and that gets pretty troubling for someone who's going to invest in our local port. So I want you to know that those thoughts resonate with me absolutely, because I hear them from the small trucking company, the big trucking company, and those associated with them. And then again, the dollars issue. I mean, I can tell you that I get it. It's our job to make sure others get it. Thank you.
Assemblymember Campos.
Mr. Chair, you had asked some of the other panelists to stay in case we wanted to have some feedback. So I'm wondering if someone from one of the previous panels could actually address some of the questions that Mr. Jack brought up about. I think you talked about cost analysis and different things, and also predictability from Cervantes. How are their issues going to be addressed as we move forward in these focus groups? And I mean, it's great that we have you in different segments, but in order to be able to have a real dialogue, it's good to be able to cross and say, okay, I hear your concerns. They're valid concerns. I think the predictability, the cost analysis, and I know that we're moving through the process. Nothing is set in stone. But as we move through this, how will those issues be addressed as we move through it in these special groups, which I probably won't be sitting at as you're having the dialogue. So if we can kind of have some sense on how you take some of these concerns into the bigger group, and as you develop the plan, that would be helpful for me.
Mr. Kelly is actually minored in economy, and he's an economist now, so we're going to
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you.
No, listen, at the chairman's request, I have stayed and listened to the last two panels, and I would say that in terms of the concerns and the interests, there's nothing there, nothing expressed or there that we're not going to take into consideration. My encouragement to this panel and the prior panel, you all heard about the public workshops that we have going on. You heard Mr. Jacks kindly say this has been a very collaborative process. These expressions are why it needs to be a collaborative process. And I think what I can just say is we're committed to hear this stuff. We're committed to figure out how to deal with it. Mr. Rossi's having direct communication with industry leaders on the issues of a competitiveness matrix, which is not an easy thing to do. But to try to find the ways to do the appropriate metrics to use to review the economic impacts of this stuff. And as I said earlier, we're also partners in this. As I mentioned that there are several revenue sources that are public dollars, and if we're going to talk about bringing those things to the fore, we also need to understand what those impacts are and how to best utilize those resources. So. My short, high-level answer is these expressions are why we're having the public workshops. It's why we're engaging back and forth. I know that the GoBiz, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, is also engaged work with Claremont McKenna on doing further cost analysis on some of these issues. So it's an ongoing, elaborative process. Unfortunately, I don't have a draft of the plan in front of you today so that we can react to specifics, but as a general matter, this communication is vitally important for all of these reasons, and that's why we're doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, RJ, in our travels throughout the state, you had shared with me that there had been, because of the lack of certainty in the industry, that we're about 500,000 truck drivers short because there's not a willingness to invest. in the industry?
Well,
Also?
nationally, if you look at the trends, we're in a severe truck driver shortage. And so here in California, there's thousands of available truck jobs out there. So certainly all this uncertainty, we've heard from folks who want to invest in distribution centers or other related infrastructure in California. And with the uncertain regulatory sphere, it's creating an environment where we can't get the locked-in investment we need.
Any other questions of the panel?
No question. Just an observation is every truck you pass on the freeway, it has the sign that drivers wanted. That's how bad the shortage is.
Right.
Well, and again, we've talked about asset retention and some kind of certainty when you make an investment. But you look at also through the ports, again, is there a better value? I think also through the Trucking Association, you shared with me how many trucks are idling. Could you share that?
Yeah, I will read you the exact figure. I brought it here today.
It's pretty compelling.
Yeah. So if you look at the amount of related to on the infrastructure side, when you look at the amount of delay that we are facing as an industry nationwide with congestion on interstates, it's the equivalent of 51,000 idle truckers and on an annual basis. So their annual work, there would be 51,000 truckers just sitting there related to the congestion.
Wow. Thank you so much, everybody, through this panel for coming today. If there's no other questions, I'm going to call to the public for public comments. Anybody in the public would like to make a comment prior to this? Hang around, Secretary, just in case. I think we have some comments. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for staying.
Chair Frazier, members of the committee, thank you for your time today. Is this on?
Sorry about that.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Frazier, members of the committee. Thank you for your time today. This has been a very productive conversation and discussion. We look forward to future discussions. My name is Ryan Kenny. I'm with Clean Energy. We're the nation's largest provider of natural gas transportation fuel. And our discussions today talked about maybe the highest and best use of state funds to resolve some of the problems that we have with sustainable freight. And our industry is supportive of using cap and trade funds for two different immediate ways to improve the problems that we have. One of which is $100 million over 5 years for heavy-duty vehicle incentives that can meet a 0.02 NOx standard. Any technology that would meet that would receive incentive funding to change from diesel into an alternative fuel. And one thing that the committee may not be aware of is that back in September, ARB did certify a 0.02 NOx natural gas engine produced by Cummins Westport. And those are ready for deployment, according to the company, in the second quarter of this year. So that's a game changer for our policy discussions and also for public health and the environment. The other one I wanted to bring up to you is right now in the budget, the proposed budget by the governor, there's $25 million dedicated for biofuels. And that's for production and infrastructure development. So we believe that upping that amount in the budget would significantly allow for more opportunities in the near term. And you combine that with a 0.02 NOx engine, it's an immediate relief for California. And of course, we know that the goals are not going to be reached of 40% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030, 50% petroleum reduction by 2030, the 8-hour ozone attainment standards and short-lived climate pollutants. We cannot reach those without the immediate benefits of these policies. So I wanted to bring those to your attention, and we'll have, I guess, further discussions as we go forward. So thank you very much.
Next, please identify yourself and who you represent, please.
Yeah, Matt Klopfenstein with the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Generally speaking, South Coast is very supportive of the plan so far and the open process that has been undertaken to develop it. We are hoping to see much more collaboration and much more effort in pushing for more low-emission engines and low-emission vehicles generally, especially with regards to freight and the ports. South Coast, along with several other local and state partners down in the Los Angeles area, helped to develop a pilot program, the Los Angeles Gateway Freight Technology Program, which will improve freight efficiency and incentivize the transition to zero and near zero emission technologies. Programs such as this are a showcase of how low emission freight can work in California. And so we encourage more work to be done in this area. Broadening these programs to include other zero, near zero emission technologies in other applications, such as construction, maintenance of roads, and infrastructure, is important to meeting the state's clean air standards and federal clean air standards for that matter. With that said, South Coast very much looks forward to working with all the stakeholders and the state in moving forward with the plan and helping to implement the plan. So thank you.
Next speaker, your name and who you represent, please. We'll keep it brief.
Is this on? Okay. Shreyas Jethger, Coalition for Clean Air. We're also one of the members of the California Cleaner Freight Coalition, which is 30 organizations across the state working to clean up the freight sector through the Strong Sustainable Freight Action Plan and other measures. First, I'd like to state that the Coalition for Clean Air supports the governor's executive order on the Freight Action Plan. And while we support a balanced approach, I think we largely heard from folks talking about the economic benefits of moving to a cleaner freight system. What we didn't hear as much of is really the public health benefits of this action. And I think that's an important point that needs to be stressed. And a couple of statistics that I think really help underscore the importance of a cleaner freight system. Each year in California, freight transport causes 2,400 people to die prematurely, 2,830 to be admitted to the hospital, 360,000 missed work days, and 1.1 million missed days of school. Another figure, nearly twice as many Californians die from traffic pollution as from motor vehicle accidents. And California leads the nation in the share of its residents, about 4 in 10, 40%, that live close enough to a freeway or a busy road that may be at increased risk of asthma, cancer, and other health hazards. So cleaning up the freight sector is very much a matter of survival. I would encourage this committee in the future to also allow for stakeholders from impacted communities to be present. They are important stakeholders in this process as well. And I think not only can they better discuss the problems of freight transport, but they also have solutions in terms of ways to clean up this sector, or really the system of systems that people have talked about. Also, I'd just like to point out that there are businesses that are developing cleaner vehicle technologies here in California. They are also important stakeholders, but I think we did not hear from them today. And perhaps I'll end by just saying we support the following principles in the state Sustainable Freight Action Plan, which is zero emission technologies wherever possible, near zero technologies where those zero emission are not yet available, but powered by renewable fuels as much as possible. And lastly, rigorous enforcement to ensure cleaner combustion now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments from the public, Vice Chair Sajan, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, Mr. Chair, but thank you for your efforts to be all over the state watching this matter move forward. Somebody brought up that the delay at the border. Is that based on that we're understaffed, or it's mechanical problems that the truckers that come to use our freeways, how safe they are?
No.
And, or is it the cargo they carry that might be something we need to be aware of?
We can increase throughput with technology, but it's a funnel. You're putting a lot of traffic into one small spot. They need to expand the ability. There's a project called Otay Mesa that needs to be moved forward. I mean, it's one of those deals, again, with what the Trucking Association has brought forward as the 51,000 trucks sitting there idling. It's one of those things that we have to look at. That is a value in itself if we could get those trucks moving on particulate, matter and GHG and the whole 9 yards. It's one of those things that what's a better value right now at this point. So thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here today. This was really a valuable discussion and one that I hope we can continue to move forward. I'd like to implore the administration to work with stakeholders in developing this plan. This effort is huge, and it needs to take into account stakeholder concerns And if the plan is indeed going to ensure that we grow, not just maintain, California's economic competitiveness, we all need to stay engaged. We can't ignore the need to reduce congestion on our roadways, and I firmly believe that addressing congestion also means reducing emissions and improving our economy. And that's a win-win for everyone. But what we have to really realize is when we start creating these demands and these regulations, ultimately there's a tipping point for any industry that they just say, we can't take it anymore. Also, when you have the trickle-down effect, it ultimately hits the consumer. By and large, everything goes to the consumer. And so we have to be thoughtful in that process also and try to attain as much as we can, but be thoughtful of other people and how it impacts them. And so I'm really thankful that the committee was here today. Thank you to the panelists who came from long distances also. And we're going to continue this discussion and follow this. And Mr. Sarek, thank you, and I look forward to partnering with you on a successful program in the administration. You're doing a great job. Thank you. With that, we'll be adjourned.